The clinking of glasses and low hum of conversation filled the luxurious restaurant, a haven for the city's elite. Soft amber lighting spilled from ornate chandeliers, highlighting the gleaming marble floors and rich burgundy drapes cascading from ceiling to floor. Waiters in crisp uniforms wove between tables, their movements smooth and precise. It was the kind of place where every detail whispered opulence, where an air of exclusivity hung as thick as the scent of aged wine. By the far corner, near the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city skyline, a woman sat alone. Her age showed in the silver streaks that ran through her dark hair, neatly tied in a bun. She wore a modest coat, its fabric slightly frayed at the edges, and a pair of well-worn shoes. Her presence was a quiet contrast to the vibrant chatter and designer-clad crowd. She hunched slightly over the menu, studying it with a mix of concentration and hesitation. A tall, clean-shaven waiter approached her table, his polished demeanor slipping ever so slightly as he glanced at her attire. His name-tag gleamed under the warm light. Thomas, with a well-practiced smile, he placed a glass of water in front of her, his movements deliberate. "Good evening," he said smoothly, though his tone carried an edge of condescension. "Are you ready to order, or should I come back later?" The woman glanced up, her hazel eyes soft but piercing. "Just a few more minutes, if that's all right," she said, her voice quiet yet steady. Thomas nodded, though the corners of his mouth twitched in barely concealed impatience. As he turned, he caught sight of a nearby table where a group of impeccably dressed patrons were chuckling. A middle-aged man in a tailored suit leaned closer and whispered something that made his companions laugh louder. Thomas smirked, glancing back at the woman's table. He strode back to the service station, muttering under his breath, "Why do people like that even come here? Just taking up space." A younger waiter, Liam, overheard him and frowned. "Hey, maybe she's here for a reason. You don't know her story." Thomas scoffed, adjusting his tie. "Please. Did you see her coat? This place isn't for people who can't afford it." At her table, the woman continued to study the menu, her fingers tracing over the elegant script. She seemed unfazed by the occasional glances thrown her way, her calm presence an enigma. A few tables over, a couple whispered to each other, their eyes flicking toward her before returning to their plates. Minutes later, Thomas returned, his professional mask back in place. "Have you decided, ma'am?" he asked, his tone just polite enough to avoid overt rudeness. She nodded, closing the menu and handing it to him. "I'll have the chef's special, please." Thomas hesitated for the briefest moment before jotting it down. "And a drink? Or will just water suffice?" His smile widened, the question pointed. The woman's gaze lingered on him, steady and unyielding. "Water will be fine, thank you." As Thomas walked away, he shook his head slightly, muttering under his breath again, "Unbelievable." But something curious began to happen. As the minutes ticked by, a ripple of subtle reactions spread across the room. A young couple at a nearby table kept stealing glances at the woman, their expressions shifting from mild curiosity to quiet recognition. A man in a tailored jacket paused mid-sentence, his eyes narrowing as though trying to place her. Even Liam, while clearing glasses, seemed to hesitate as he caught sight of her profile. Thomas, oblivious to the growing buzz, continued about his tasks, his thoughts only on finishing his shift. When the woman's meal arrived, he delivered it with mechanical precision, barely sparing her a glance. "Enjoy," he said curtly before walking away. As the woman began to eat, her movements graceful and deliberate, the room seemed to grow quieter. Conversations tapered off, replaced by murmurs and the occasional audible gasp. People were whispering now, their voices hushed but charged with energy. Thomas, noticing the shift in atmosphere, frowned and glanced around. "What's going on?" he asked Liam, who had stopped mid-step, his tray of glasses trembling slightly. Liam opened his mouth to respond, but hesitated, his eyes darting to the woman's table. I think you should pay more attention," he said finally, his voice low. "What are you talking about?" Thomas scoffed, brushing past him. But as he turned to glance back at the woman, something in the air seemed to shift. For the first time, he noticed the way people were looking at her, not with disdain or mockery, but with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Thomas returned to the older woman's table, his posture just a touch too stiff, his smile thin and forced. She had finished her meal and sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, looking out the window at the shimmering city lights. The faint glow from the streets cast a soft halo around her figure. "Would you like dessert, or should I bring the check?" Thomas asked, his tone carrying the faintest trace of impatience. The woman looked up at him with a calm expression. "No dessert, thank you. Just the check, please." Thomas nodded sharply and walked off, muttering under his breath again. He passed a group of well-dressed patrons near the bar who were now openly staring at the woman's table. Their conversation dropped to murmurs. One of the men whispered something to his companions, and they all turned to look, their faces painted with curiosity and surprise. "Why is everyone acting so strange tonight?" Thomas hissed to Liam as they passed each other near the register. Liam hesitated, his eyes flicking nervously toward the woman. "I don't think you realize who that might be." Thomas let out a short laugh, his disbelief clear. "Oh, come on. She's just some lady who probably wandered in here thinking it was a diner. She's way out of place." Liam's expression tightened, but he said nothing, only shaking his head as he continued with his work. Thomas grabbed the check and returned to the table, placing it down with an air of finality. "Whenever you're ready, ma'am," he said, and then he walked away without waiting for a response. Moments later, one of the bartenders leaned toward him, his voice low but urgent. "Hey, man, you might have screwed up big time." "What are you talking about?" Thomas asked, irritation creeping into his voice. "Look at her." "Really look," the bartender insisted, nodding toward the table where the woman sat today. "She looks familiar, doesn't she? Like, really familiar." Thomas glanced back, but his skepticism remained. The woman had opened her small purse and was pulling out a card to settle her bill. Her movements were calm and deliberate, entirely unbothered by the growing tension in the room. "Familiar how?" Thomas asked, his tone dismissive. "She's just an older lady. I don't see anything special about her." Before the bartender could respond, a soft gasp rippled through the room. Thomas turned just in time to see one of the patrons, a younger woman in an elegant black dress, rise from her table and approach the older woman hesitantly. Her steps were tentative, her face flushed with nervous excitement. "Excuse me," the younger woman said softly, her voice trembling just enough to carry across the quiet room. I just wanted to say I've always admired your work. You're an inspiration." The older woman looked up, her serene expression warming into a kind smile. "That's very sweet of you to say, dear," she replied, her voice soft yet filled with genuine warmth. Thomas froze where he stood, his mind racing as he processed what he had just heard. Inspiration? Work? What was going on? More people were whispering now, heads turning, eyes widening as recognition spread like wildfire. A man pulled out his phone, his screen glowing as he pointed it discreetly toward the table. Thomas felt his stomach twist as realization began to dawn on him. Liam appeared at his side, his voice low but firm. "Do you get it now? That's Scarlett Johansson." "What?" Thomas sputtered, his voice louder than intended. He clamped his mouth shut, his face flushing with embarrassment as several heads turned his way. "She's wearing no makeup, No designer stuff, nothing flashy. But that's her. I'm telling you, Liam said, his tone a mix of awe and exasperation. Thomas's heart sank as he stared at the woman. The calm, understated confidence. The way she carried herself. And now the faces of the other patrons, their awe and admiration unmistakable. It was her. Scarlett Johansson, sitting quietly in the corner, eating alone while he had dismissed her as some nobody. "Oh no," Thomas muttered under his breath, panic setting in as he realized the gravity of his mistake. Thomas's heart pounded as the realization hit him like a freight train. His palms began to sweat as he watched the woman sit quietly, unfazed by the growing attention around her. More patrons were leaning in toward one another, their voices hushed but buzzing with excitement. Phones were coming out now, some blatantly snapping photos, while others tried to be more discreet. He turned back to Liam, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why didn't anyone tell me earlier?" Liam gave him a hard look, his frustration evident. "We tried. But you didn't want to listen, did you? You were too busy judging her by her coat." Thomas wiped his hands on his apron, his face growing pale. "What do I do now? Should I apologize? Should I?" Before he could finish, a commotion broke out at a nearby table. A man had stood up, his excitement spilling over into his voice. "It really is her. Scarlett Johansson." The room erupted. Conversations that had been restrained and quiet exploded into audible gasps, cheers, and applause. Thomas felt the heat rise in his cheeks as he realized there was no escaping the attention now. Every eye in the restaurant was fixed on the woman. Scarlett Johansson, the international superstar, sitting quietly in a modest coat in the corner of a fine dining restaurant, and he had treated her like an afterthought. Scarlett glanced up at the growing crowd, her expression calm and gracious. She waved lightly, a soft, humble smile on her face. The reaction only intensified. Some patrons clapped louder, others called out her name, and a few even approached her table, asking for selfies or autographs. Thomas watched, frozen in place. The energy in the room was electric, but all he could focus on was the heavy weight of guilt pressing down on him. He had spent the evening mocking her to Liam, rolling his eyes at her requests, assuming she didn't belong here. Now the very people he thought she didn't measure up to were treating her like royalty. As Scarlett handled the crowd with patience and kindness, Thomas felt his stomach churn. He had never been in this position before. He'd always prided himself on his ability to read people, to know who mattered and who didn't. But tonight he'd been wrong. So very wrong. He watched as Scarlett finally rose from her seat, her calm presence commanding the room without effort. She thanked the people around her, politely declining most of the requests but offering warm smiles in return. As she stepped toward the exit, she caught Thomas's eye, her gaze steady and unreadable. His breath caught in his throat. Was she angry? Disappointed? He couldn't tell. Panic gripped him, and before he knew it, he was moving toward her, his feet carrying him without thought. "Miss Johansson," he stammered, his voice cracking slightly. I'm so sorry. I didn't realize." She held up a hand, silencing him with a single, elegant gesture. "You didn't realize who I was," she said softly, her tone firm but not unkind. "But that shouldn't matter, should it?" Thomas's face burned as her words sank in. She wasn't angry. She was disappointed. And somehow that felt worse. He struggled to find the words, his mouth dry. "You're right. I'm so sorry for how I treated you. It was wrong." Scarlett nodded, her expression softening slightly. "We all make mistakes. The important thing is to learn from them." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Thomas standing in the middle of the room, feeling like the smallest person in the world. The crowd parted for her as she left, some still clapping, others snapping pictures. Thomas slumped against the counter, his heart heavy with regret. He had spent so much time worrying about appearances, judging people by what they wore or how they carried themselves, that he'd forgotten the simple truth Scarlett had just reminded him of. Kindness costs nothing, and everyone deserves respect, no matter who they are. As the door to the restaurant closed behind Scarlett, the room buzzed with excitement and disbelief. People were talking over one another, recounting what had just happened, showing off blurry photos and videos they'd managed to take. Thomas stood rooted to the spot, his face pale and his hands trembling slightly. He could still feel the weight of her words echoing in his mind. But that shouldn't matter, should it? Liam walked up beside him, his voice low but pointed. You really messed that one up, huh? Thomas didn't reply. He couldn't. His throat felt tight, and his chest was heavy with shame. All he could think about was the way Scarlett had looked at him, not with anger or contempt, but with disappointment, as if she had expected better. That look hurt more than anything else. A few patrons glanced his way, some with judgment in their eyes, others with pity. Thomas had never felt so exposed. It was as if the entire room had seen right through him, to the part of himself he wasn't proud of, the part that judged too quickly and cared too much about appearances. I didn't mean to, he started, but his words felt hollow even to himself. He shook his head, rubbing his temples as if trying to erase the memory of the night. The restaurant manager appeared, his face stern and unreadable. Thomas, he said firmly. A word. Thomas followed him to the back, his stomach churning with nerves. The manager crossed his arms and leaned against the counter, his expression unreadable. You know who that was, don't you? He asked. Thomas nodded, his voice barely a whisper. Yes, sir. And you understand how your behavior reflected on us tonight? Yes, Thomas said again, his head hanging low. I was wrong. I shouldn't have treated her, or anyone, like that. The manager sighed, his voice softening just slightly. This isn't just about her being famous. It's about how you treat people, period. Every single guest who walks through those doors deserves respect. You've been here long enough to know that. Thomas nodded, swallowing hard. I know. And I'll do better. I swear. The manager studied him for a moment before nodding. You'll have to earn back that trust, Thomas. Not just from me, but from everyone here. When Thomas returned to the dining area, the energy had started to settle, though the air still buzzed with residual excitement. Liam approached him again, this time with a look of quiet encouragement. You okay? Liam asked. I don't know, Thomas admitted. I feel awful. I can't believe I acted that way. Well, Liam said, shrugging, at least now you know. And you can change, right? Thomas gave a small nod, though the weight of the night still pressed heavily on him. As the last of the patrons trickled out, he found himself lingering by the table where Scarlett had sat. The empty seat, the untouched napkin, it all felt like a reminder of his mistake. He picked up the napkin to clear it, but his hand froze when he saw a small note written in elegant handwriting. Kindness matters. Always. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that hit Thomas right in the chest. He stared at the note for a long time, his fingers trembling slightly. It was as if she had known exactly what he needed to hear. For the first time that night, he felt something other than shame. He felt determination. Determination to be better, to treat people the way they deserved to be treated, regardless of who they were or what they looked like. He folded the note carefully and slipped it into his pocket. It wasn't just a message. It was a second chance. As the night wound down and the restaurant lights dimmed for closing, Thomas sat alone at one of the side tables, staring at the small, folded note in his hand. The weight of the evening sat heavily on his chest, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he had learned something tonight he wouldn't easily forget. He read the words again. Asterisk, kindness matters. Always. Asterisk, they were simple, but they seemed to echo in his mind louder than anything else. Liam walked over, his steps light but his expression serious. He placed a cup of coffee on the table in front of Thomas and slid into the seat across from him. "You're still thinking about it, huh?" Thomas sighed, running a hand through his hair. "How could I not? She didn't even seem mad. That's what's killing me. She wasn't angry, she just expected better." "Yeah, well," Liam said with a small shrug, "she's got a point. You treated her like she didn't belong here just because of what she was wearing. That's not who you want to be, right?" Thomas shook his head. "Of course not. But I was so focused on appearances, on making sure everything looked perfect, that I didn't stop to think about who she really was, or who anyone really is, for that matter." Liam sipped his coffee and leaned back. "It's a good lesson to learn, though. Better now than later." Thomas nodded, the truth of Liam's words sinking in. He thought back to all the little moments throughout the night, the way Scarlett had remained calm and composed despite his dismissive attitude, the way she had handled the crowd with grace, and the quiet dignity in her response to his apology. She hadn't needed to say much. Her actions had spoken louder than any words could have. As they sat in silence, the manager passed by on his way out. He paused at their table and gave Thomas a long, measured look. "You still thinking about tonight?" Thomas nodded. "Yeah, I feel like I let everyone down. Her, the team, even myself." The manager's expression softened slightly. "What matters is what you do next. Learn from it. Treat everyone with respect, not because of who they might be, but because it's the right thing to do. If you can do that, you'll be fine." After the manager left, Thomas sat quietly for a moment, letting the words sink in. He looked around the now empty restaurant, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the space. The polished floors reflected the soft glow of the dimmed lights, and everything felt still. It was a stark contrast to the chaos and noise of earlier, and in the quiet, Thomas felt a sense of clarity he hadn't had before. The note in his pocket felt warm against his hand as he stood to leave. He made his way to the front door, turning off the last of the lights as he went. Before stepping out into the cool night air, he paused and looked back at the empty room. It was just a restaurant, a place where people came and went, but tonight it had been the setting for something that felt much bigger. As he walked home, the city lights blurred in the distance, and Thomas thought about how easily he had judged someone who had taught him one of the most important lessons of his life. It wasn't just about Scarlett Johansson. It was about everyone he'd ever overlooked or dismissed without a second thought. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he promised himself he'd do better. He wouldn't just try to recognize the Scarletts of the world. He'd treat every person with the kindness and respect they deserved, no matter who they were or where they came from. It was a small change, but as he looked at the note one last time, he realized that sometimes the smallest changes could make the biggest difference.